Hello everyone. Welcome to Earth Archives. Today, we're going to take you back to 16th century France to explore how a legendary queen influenced French dessert culture and led a revolution in the world of sweets. This revolution wasn't just about flavor innovation. It also involved changes in societal culture and gender perceptions of the time. The protagonist of our story today is none other than Catherine de Medici, the queen from the famous Italian Medici family. Her name not only left a significant mark in history, but her arrival also sparked an unprecedented development in French dessert culture. But before we dive in, let's first talk about the origins of desserts in history, because, after all, the history of sweets is actually quite fascinating. The origin of desserts. Why did humans need sweets? When it comes to desserts, many people's eyes light up at the thought of cakes, ice cream, and chocolate, with the mere scent making your mouth water. But did you know that in the early days of human history, desserts weren't a necessity at all? Our bodies are quite capable of synthesizing enough sugar on their own, and not eating sweets didn't make a difference. Humans could still run, jump, and thrive. Imagine early humans gnawing on roasted meat, patting their bellies, and then heading out to hunt. Who had time for desserts? Back then, sweetness was a rare commodity, and the most you could hope for was a bit of comfort from fruits. Cream cakes, frosted cookies, those things didn't even exist. So, desserts weren't initially about filling the stomach. Over time, they evolved into something more of a show-off item, especially within noble circles. Serving a platter of desserts was practically saying, "Look at how rich I am." The history of desserts was initially closely tied to luxury. In noble societies, sugar was a rare commodity, more precious than gold. To eat something sweet was a symbol of status. Imagine Europe in the Middle Ages, with castles brightly lit at night. Nobles gathered around long tables, and servants brought in plates of pastries dusted with powdered sugar. The sweet aroma would fill the entire room as everyone took small bites with silver forks, secretly comparing whose dessert was the most extravagant. Sugar was ridiculously expensive back then, not something just anyone could get their hands on. It had to be brought from the east through long-distance trade, and a small bag of sugar could be traded for a horse. So, showcasing desserts at a banquet wasn't just about the food. It was a dual display of wealth and status. As for the common people, they could only smell the sweetness from afar. At home, they'd still be nibbling on bread, and if they were lucky, they might get a bit of honey for a treat. Desserts were not a daily indulgence. They were more like a status symbol for the nobles, a way of showing off not just sugar, but their prestige. Desserts went from being something optional to something elevated. They didn't come into existence because humans needed sugar. They came about because people loved showing off and indulging in luxury. Over time, desserts climbed their way to the center of the dining table, not because they were necessary, but because they represented status and pleasure. Eventually, sugar became more common, and desserts began to find their way into ordinary homes. But even then, the aura of luxury stuck around. Think about it. When you bite into a delicate macaron today, there's still that little sense of satisfaction, that feeling of being a bit fancy, almost like a noble. The connection between desserts and women, a history full of gender bias. In Europe centuries ago, desserts were not just a casual matter of eating and drinking. They were closely tied to the role of women in society. The social atmosphere of the time was quite fascinating. Women were expected to be gentle and obedient, managing the household, while men believed they were naturally superior, especially when it came to cooking. Desserts, with their intricate preparation, were seen as something women could handle, though men still felt their skills would always surpass theirs. Ironically, this mindset ended up placing desserts firmly in women's hands, transforming them into a secret weapon in their social circles. Imagine, in a medieval European noble home, the lady of the house, dressed in an elegant gown, sweating in the kitchen, whipping cream, dusting sugar, and presenting a tray of desserts. The guests' eyes would light up as they admired her work. But it wasn't just about food, it was about pleasing others. In the fragrance of those desserts, there was a hidden power, women's cunning and status. Whoever ate them had no choice but to compliment her, saying, "How virtuous you are." This kind of bias might sound amusing, but over time it became a part of the culture. Desserts were no longer just a tool for the nobility to flaunt their wealth. They also became a social passport for noble women. In the aristocratic society of the time, if a woman could personally present a plate of exquisite desserts, like a cake piled high with cream or a tray of sugar-dusted pastries, that was no small feat. Guests would gather around the table, take a bite of the sweet treat, savor the flavor, and then nod approvingly, saying, "Such skill, truly impressive." The lady of the house, standing by, would smile with both gentleness and pride, secretly awarding herself points. But this wasn't something done casually. It took thought and time. The sugar had to be perfectly caramelized, the cream whipped to a cloud-like consistency. And the moment the dish was presented, it was practically an elevator to higher social status. A well-made dessert could elevate a woman's standing, and it became an unspoken rule in the aristocratic circles. The more impressive the dessert a woman could serve, the more respect her household gained. Desserts became so tightly bound to the image of women in European aristocratic society. What started as a small matter that men looked down on was eventually turned into something women mastered, transforming from a way to please others into a powerful tool in social circles. Over time, this bias actually became a tradition, with some even saying that a woman who could make desserts was a true noble lady. Picture an afternoon tea in a noble home. The desserts arrive, their fragrance filling the air. Guests chat happily while savoring the sweets, an atmosphere of warmth and elegance. So, the next time you talk about desserts, don't forget to mention this sweet battlefield of women. Catherine de Medici, the noble queen in dessert history. When talking about the history of French desserts, we can't forget to mention the major figure who sparked the sweet revolution, Catherine de Medici. This queen, hailing from the powerful Medici family in Italy, wasn't just a master of political maneuvering. She also brought a sweet cultural explosion to the French table. Imagine in 16th century France, where a bit of bread with butter was considered a fancy meal. Catherine arrived, bringing her Italian flair and transformed desserts from a minor treat into a grand spectacle. She was a force to be reckoned with, not only stabilizing France politically, but also slyly introducing Italy's dessert secrets to the French, changing their culinary world forever. After her arrival, France's dessert culture would never be the same again. Catherine's family was no ordinary one. The Medici family made their fortune in banking, and by the time of the Renaissance, they were thriving, wealthy, influential, and with a deep appreciation for the arts. Catherine herself was no lightweight. She grew up immersed in Italy's rich cultural environment, with an eye for the finer things in life. Her marriage to King Henry II of France, at its core, was a political alliance, a strategic maneuver, with both sides playing their cards carefully. But who could have predicted that this union would not only bring power, but also deliver an import of sweet delights? The Italian court culture she brought with her was like a grand gift box, filled with the most advanced dessert techniques of the time. Imagine Catherine's entourage included a group of Italian pastry masters, each carrying trunks packed with secret recipes for sugar glazes and baking tips. When they arrived at the French court, nobles were instantly captivated by the sweet aromas filling the air. What is this heavenly taste? They must have wondered. These dessert techniques were not just any ordinary skills. By the time Catherine arrived in France, Italy had already elevated desserts to the level of art, with creations like cream puff pastries and jam cakes, each one as delicate as a painting. When Catherine introduced these masters to the French court, the French chefs were astonished and quickly started learning the craft. But she didn't stop there. Simply copying wasn't enough for her. She made sure to improve and adapt the recipes to better suit the local French palate. At court banquets, when desserts were brought to the table, there were glistening golden cakes and the sweet aroma of sugar filling the room. The nobles enjoying these delights would praise the queen, saying, "She really brought something special." From then on, French desserts began to thrive, and iconic treats like macarons and cream puffs were directly linked to this sweet revolution. Catherine's efforts not only sweetened King Henry II's life, but also became a key part of French history. Italian influence. The birth of ice cream and macarons. The most remarkable impact Catherine de Medici had on French dessert history was the introduction of ice cream. This treat wasn't always as refined as it is today. The ancient Greeks had already played around with frozen desserts, but back then it was just crushed ice mixed with honey. Refreshing, but nothing special. It wasn't until the Italian Renaissance that pastry chefs started to get creative. One such innovator, a man named Ruggieri, came up with a game-changer gelato. This treat, made from fruit and ice, would be churned into a refreshing dessert. When it was served, the nobles were amazed. It was like a cool breeze in the summer. Imagine, in an Italian court, Ruggieri stirring his fruit and ice mixture with a wooden spoon, a proud grin on his face. The nobles gathered around, marveling at the sweet concoction, and suddenly, a sweet craze began to spread. When Catherine married King Henry II and introduced gelato at their French wedding, the scene was nothing short of a sensation. The nobles scooped up a spoonful and tasted the icy, fruity flavor burst on their tongues, praising the Queen for bringing such a treasure. From that moment on, gelato took hold in the French court, and after some refinement, it eventually evolved into the ice cream we love today, becoming a regular at royal banquets. Another dessert star, the macaron, also made its way to France alongside Catherine's suitcase. This little treat originally came from Italy, where it is said to have been created by monks in a monastery as a simple dessert. It was round and flat, resembling the brim of a monk's hood. When Catherine brought her team of Italian chefs to France, these small treats crossed the seas and entered the royal court. Imagine a scene in the French royal kitchen, where Italian chefs are busy baking almond cookies, their fragrance filling the air. Catherine, standing by, directs them, saying, "Add more sugar, make them more delicate." The nobles, holding these small macaroons, take a bite and find them crispy and sweet, with their eyes narrowing in delight. What started as a humble treat, when handed over to the French, was transformed into something more elaborate, filled with cream, with colorful shells, and slowly became the star of banquets. From the rough little cookies of the monastery to the refined desserts of the palace, the macaroon's upgrade was thanks to Catherine's vision and the skilled hands of the French. Catherine truly dropped a bombshell in the French dessert world. Gelato chilled its way into the noble stomachs, and macaroons sweetened their hearts, marking the beginning of a new chapter in France's dessert history. The next time you talk about desserts, don't forget to mention this queen of sweets. She brought ice cream and macaroons from Italy, transforming the French court into a sweet paradise. The impact she made is so sweet that it leaves a lasting, delicious aftertaste. Sponge cake, another dessert revolution. Catherine de Medici's surprises for the French dessert world weren't just limited to ice cream and macaroons. There was also the light and fluffy sponge cake. This treat is truly a hero in the dessert family. Although its earliest traces can be found in the 16th century, sponge cake back then was still quite primitive, without any special flair. When Catherine brought it from Italy to France, it was likely just a simple egg batter baked into a cake. The nobles found it decent, but it didn't have that wow factor. Imagine a scene in the royal kitchen, where Italian chefs are whipping the batter, baking a golden cake that, when sliced, looks a bit dense. It tastes okay, but nothing extraordinary. However, this was just the beginning. The real magic didn't happen until the 18th century, when pastry chefs began to get creative and took sponge cake to new heights. By the 18th century, these pastry chefs were no amateurs. They discovered a little secret, whisking the eggs until they were as fluffy as clouds, filled with air, and then mixing them into the batter. The result? The cake would rise, becoming larger in size and transforming from a solid young man to a light, delicate young woman. Imagine the scene in the kitchen, with eggs being beaten loudly, pastry chefs sweating, their wrists nearly cramping. But when they look at the fluffy batter, their eyes light up. When the oven door opens, the hot air rushes out, and the cake puffs up like a little balloon. golden and inviting. A gentle press, and it springs back. This texture was nothing short of a revolution in the dessert world. From then on, sponge cake became the versatile base for French pastry chefs, allowing them to create all sorts of variations. Lighter, more elastic mini cakes that you could grab and eat in an instant. Swiss rolls, rolled like a scroll with a surprise of jam inside. And the magnificent Trianon cake, with layers upon layers, its buttery cream so irresistible that it made your mouth water. All of these treats owed their success to the universal brick of sponge cake. When Catherine first brought sponge cake to France, she probably never imagined it would become such a sensation. From its rough beginnings in the 16th century to the technical transformation in the 18th century, this cake went from being a minor side dish in the royal court to becoming the superstar of the dessert world. During afternoon tea, when sponge cake is served alongside some tea, each bite is soft and light, never too heavy, leaving everyone smiling in delight. Her Italian legacy, combined with the French mastery, turned this cake into a classic and gave rise to a whole generation of desserts that are still beloved today. Catherine's fashion and the evolution of desserts. Catherine de Medici, the Italian-born queen, didn't just bring ice cream and sponge cakes to France. She was practically a one-woman powerhouse, introducing not only desserts, but also fashion and lifestyle into the daily lives of French nobility. Though her marriage to Henry II was far from ideal, with everyone in the noble circle knowing her husband preferred his mistress, Catherine didn't let her personal troubles hold her back. With her impeccable taste and vision, she became an icon of her time. Imagine the 16th century French court, where people dressed in bulky clothing and ate rough meals. Then, here comes Catherine, walking in with the flair of the Italian Renaissance, and the nobles could hardly believe their eyes. This queen didn't just know how to enjoy food, she knew how to live. From desserts to fashion, she gave the French a glamorous lesson in style. The Italian corset she brought was a bold innovation at the time. Back then, French nobility still wore loose robes that dragged as they walked. But when Catherine appeared, her waist was tightly cinched, her curves clearly defined. The noblewomen were left in awe, immediately following her lead, declaring this the true essence of elegance. Then there was perfume, already popular in Italy. Catherine casually sprayed it, and soon the room was filled with a blend of floral, fruity, and sweet dessert scents. The nobles couldn't resist, and from then on, the French began applying perfume, turning the court into a fragrant garden. The funniest part was the fork. In Italy, it was used smoothly, but the French were still eating with their hands, tearing into meat. Catherine couldn't stand it and firmly placed a fork into their hands. Imagine a scene at a banquet where she gracefully used a fork to pick up a piece of gelato, while nearby nobles awkwardly tried to poke at their cake with forks. Awkward yet amusing. Slowly, though, the fork became a standard tool at French tables. Catherine's influence didn't just sweeten the French palate. She also elevated their way of life. She turned desserts into court essentials, made corsets, perfume, and fork symbols of nobility, and brought the refined Italian elegance into France. Despite her troubled marriage, her keen eye for fashion and food made her the fashion matriarch in the eyes of the French. In the court, noble women donned tight corsets, sprayed perfume, and ate macarons with forks while chatting. An obvious fan club for Catherine. Her influence continued to echo through time, and even today, French desserts and fashion still carry a bit of her legacy. Dessert culture and gender perceptions, a symbol of power and identity. When it comes to Catherine de Medici, the driving force behind the dessert revolution, her story is not just a sweet palace legend. It also hides some of the societal views of women at the time. Despite being a powerful queen who brought ice cream, macarons, fashion, and forks to the French aristocracy, in 16th century France, she could not escape the old-fashioned label. Women were seen as merely existing to please men. The social atmosphere at the time was quite exaggerated, with men believing a woman's role should revolve around the household, cooking, making desserts, and serving the family. These were considered a woman's natural duties, while politics, war, and business were strictly the domain of men. Imagine Catherine busy in the court, presenting gelato, while the nobles shower her with praise. Yet behind the scenes some still whispered, no matter how powerful she is, she's just a woman who can make desserts, right? This bias was a bit too sweet, but with an underlying bitterness. Within this gender framework, desserts were given a female label and became the exclusive stage for noble women. Despite Catherine's significant power, the dessert techniques she introduced were still confined to the realm of things women should do. In aristocratic society at the time, a woman's social standing largely depended on her skills in the kitchen. Imagine, before a court banquet, noble women in tight corsets, sweating as they whipped cream and baked sponge cakes, all while smiling sweetly and gracefully, waiting for guests to compliment them with "how virtuous." This wasn't something done casually. Making good desserts could elevate a woman's social status, like a ticket to higher circles, granted by sugar and frosting. Catherine was no exception. Her dessert revolution was groundbreaking, but to many, it was still seen as a trick played within the women's domain, ultimately aimed at pleasing men and proving her worth. This gender stereotype turned desserts into a symbol of noble women, and behind the sweetness, there was a touch of helplessness. Catherine's story, sweet yet bittersweet, reveals the societal prejudices of the time. No matter how powerful or influential she became, she still had to operate within these frameworks, using desserts as a tool to secure her place in the aristocratic circle. The box of dessert recipes she brought from Italy didn't just sweeten the French palate. It also became a survival tactic for her and other noble women. In the noble estates, when desserts were placed on the table, the sweet aromas filled the air, and everyone ate happily. But who would have thought that behind all of this was the confined role women were forced to play? Catherine de Medici, the queen who sailed across the seas from Italy, was truly a remarkable figure. Not only did she make waves in the political circles of France, but she also turned the world of desserts into a legend. Imagine in 16th century French court, where the nobility was still eating hard bread with a bit of butter, thinking it was fancy. Then came Catherine, bringing with her the flair of the Italian Renaissance, with her suitcase packed full of dessert secrets. When she married Henry II, she brought along a team of Italian pastry masters. These chefs stood in the kitchen, whipping cream, baking cakes, and filling the air with delicious scents. The nobles, overwhelmed by the aroma, were stunned and remarked, "This queen is something special. Her food even has style." Ice cream, macarons, sponge cake. These sweet delights all came from her influence. When a tray of these treats was brought to a royal banquet, the room would fill with the sweet aroma of sugar, and the nobles, as they ate, would praise her, their eyes narrowing in contentment. This wave of sweetness didn't just stay in France. It spread across Europe, transforming desserts into a global treasure. Catherine's influence wasn't just about sweetening the nobles' palates. She practically gave French dessert culture wings. Ice cream, starting with gelato, made its debut with refreshing fruit flavors, and the nobles couldn't stop scooping it up. Macarons, once rough little treats from the monastery, were transformed into delicate, colorful balls in the royal court, crispy and sweet with every bite. Sponge cake was later improved to become light and fluffy like clouds, becoming the universal base for desserts. These sweets, born in the French court, spread across Europe and eventually took the world by storm, with everyone who tasted them falling in love, declaring the flavors irresistible. But think about it, the driving force behind it all was Catherine. She brought Italy's dessert techniques with her and allowed the French to add their own flair. From then on, desserts were no longer just something to eat, they became a cultural imprint. Today, when you take a bite of ice cream or a macaroon, that sweetness carries the story of centuries past, all ignited by Catherine. She wasn't just the queen of Henry II. She was the supercharger of dessert history, literally sprinkling frosting into the world's taste buds. Today's desserts are no longer just simple treats to satisfy a craving. They carry the marks of history, like an old friend that can tell stories. Each bite of ice cream cools the heart, and each macaroon melts sweetly in your mouth, a legacy of what Catherine brought all those years ago. The next time you talk about desserts, don't forget to mention this queen of sweets. From Italy to France, she spread sweetness across the world, sweet on the tongue, fragrant in history. Truly, she was the queen of desserts. Thank you everyone for watching today's video. If you're interested in this piece of history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what your favorite French dessert is. See you next time.